Hey guys, welcome back to another Dragonheir Silent Gods video. I'm so sorry it's been a while since I last posted, but over the next week or so I'm going to be getting back into the swing of things. It's been a very busy time for me. So today we're going to be covering one of the 5 gear dungeons, especially as in the next few days we're going to be going into the period of time where all of the legendary forge material drop rates are increased. So effectively we're going to be nearly doubling our income of legendary gear, and this is where it becomes really efficient to start farming your gear sets for your heroes and building out your teams to be way more effective than they are currently. So the first dungeon I'm going to tackle is the Grave of Venom, as in my opinion it's probably the most important dungeon to be farming. Getting yourself a good set of damage gear for multiple different types is so important, as you use so many teams in this game that you want to make sure that no matter the situation you're covered for multiple different types of damage gear. So I personally would like to have at least 3 types of kind of gear sets for each situation. So for example, if we have a look at one of my builds here, if we look at Oster, so I've got a inventor set on my Oster, and as you can see here, that gives me attack percent, crit rate, and also increases my damage every time I use a battle skill or an ultimate skill, and also that adds up to 32% increased damage, especially on heroes like Ice Blast, where you're able to frequently get that buff and keep it rolling at all times. I think most heroes will actually be able to get a very good use out of this set. In my opinion, it's probably the best damage set in the game this season. But obviously, that all does depend on what you're actually looking for. So if you're using a derivative damage dealer, of course, you're going to want to use the Abyssal Shadow set. But as you can see in my gear plans here, if we sort that by name, at the moment I've got 2 different types of accuracy damage dealing sets. I've got 2 different types of normal damage dealing sets and a derivative damage set. In the long term, I would like to have more options for these so that when I'm facing different bosses, different things such as the Famiander Pillar of Trials, I can kind of swap between all these sets on the heroes that I'm using to get the most out of the builds. You don't need crazy builds for every single hero because it is so easy to move things around in this game, but having enough of these core sets is so important to really push you that little bit further. So, as I say, in terms of Grave of Venom, the team I'm using here, obviously I'm using 2 legendaries and 3 epics. There are more accessible teams, but at the moment I don't have the resources to put into those heroes until we get access to the test server, or we get a little bit further into the season where I can actually start to build out some of those rares to test out more teams that are more accessible for everybody. But given the fact that we are in Season 2 now, I'd like to think that most people do have a good selection of epics at least, and maybe a handful of legendaries that they can kind of alternate between and use in these kind of areas. This serves more as a kind of basis for how to actually run this dungeon and build out your teams. So my Garius here, he is going to be my main tank in this dungeon. So I've got him placed in the middle so that the boss is going to be attacking him at all times. I've got my Fruabath, so he is in range of my Garius just to help with the healing to keep my Garius alive. He's also my attack penalty for this boss. So as you can see on his ultimate skill, he provides attack penalty. He's also in the Cyril set, so every time he does place a debuff, he's going to give everybody 15% attack for 10 seconds. Next up, I've got my Jillian. So my Jillian is my healer in this, so she is in the Ally Protection set, the Ancestral Protection, sorry. So that basically means that she's going to take 15% of the damage that the rest of my team are taking. This is most notable for my Garius, just to help him stay alive a little bit longer. Next up, I've got my Varesh. So Varesh is in one of my accuracy damage sets. He's in a Gambler set, so he's going to have a chance to deal true damage, to which scales on the target's max HP, up to 200% of his attack. So as you can see, he's got a decent amount of attack, some crit rate, some crit damage, and a good amount of accuracy. That's because I want to make sure he's landing the Witch's Remains defense penalty on as many targets as possible. And then next up, as I've already shown, I've got Oster as my damage dealer here, so he's got 79% crit rate. I would love to have more, and a good amount of attack and some crit damage as well. So Oster there, it is in this run to effectively take out these Flame of Elements as soon as possible and to kill the boss. So in terms of the boss's skills, if we have a little look at that, so the Flame of Elements, they literally just attack with the boss. In Season 1, there was only 2 of these, and one of them dealt defense penalty to your heroes, and the other one attacked your lowest HP target. So they're a little bit different this time around. They will just attack with the boss. So yeah, it's a little bit more kind of, I personally think it's easier to manage because you don't have to worry about dispelling a defense penalty debuff, and you don't have to worry about having a low HP tank for the second one. Instead, you just need to make sure that your whole team's a little bit tankier and can stay alive. So for the boss's skills, the first skill deals poison damage to all enemies and dispels 1 debuff from all allies. So this is relatively annoying because it could dispel the attack penalty or your defense penalty. But obviously that's just something you have to deal with. The second skill deals poison damage to enemies within range. Third skill dashes to the current target's location, performs a triple kick, each dealing poison damage and triggering the flame of element poisons simultaneous attack. So that is the strong single target hit that we used to have to deal with in season 1, but at the same time it's joining up with the flame of element, so you want to make sure that as few of them are as alive as possible as you go through the fight. On auto, I have noticed that these do actually get focused by your team anyway, so it's not too much of an issue. You will be picking these orbs off throughout the fight. And then, as you can see here, the Deadly Harpy's attacks have a 90% chance of triggering an assistance from the Flame of Element. So that always remains the same target as the Deadly Harpies, and every debuff on the Flame of Element, it reduces the assistance rate by 30%. So you want to bring lots of debuffs, which is why Varesh is incredibly strong again, because he's also bringing buff Prohibition. Next up, we've got another passive, which makes the boss immune to all control effects. So this is kind of expected. All of the dungeons do have this passive, so you just won't be able to kind of stun it, you won't be able to provoke or to taunt it, so you just need to deal with the boss effectively. So as you can see, I'm not running any skill timings for this boss, I'm just letting them do as they want. So if we have a little look at the run here, as you can see, my team are going to focus on the orbs at the start. My Garius is going to be taking the brunt of the damage. Of course, the rest of my team do take damage from the AoE skills. That's unavoidable, unfortunately, but aside from that, you're just going to be making sure you're keeping a good amount of debuffs on the boss, especially attack penalty. It's so important for this. And aside from that, you're killing the orbs, and then you're going to be moving on to killing the boss. One thing that's important to mention is, just like in Season 1, your tank staying alive is kind of the key to this. So taking your tank up to level 100 before anybody else is a really smart idea, because it could be the difference between you being able to push into Stage 9 or being stuck on Stage 7 or Stage 8. So think about that when you're investing in your team. As long as your tank can survive, you're going to be a lot more likely to be able to clear this content. So if we let this run through, I'll jump back in at the end of the run and we'll talk about different options you could use in this team. As I say, obviously I don't have the ability to build every single hero in the game at the moment, but there are a lot more options that are a bit more free-to-play friendly that you could definitely use in place of the team that I'm using. So yeah, I'll be back at the end of the run. And there we go. So as I say, it is a very simple fight as long as you're able to keep your team alive. The biggest one to keep alive, though, is the tank, because that triple hit from the boss does deal a lot of damage. If we look at the damage breakdown here, it's basically Varesh and my Oster doing all of the damage. These two could be replaced by plenty of different options, so I will break those down in a second. In terms of using Garius and Furabath together, they are incredibly strong, but I know a lot of people either have one or neither of them. So if you choose to use, or if you have to use a different tank option, you will want to bring in a second support instead of the second tank. So for example, I've got my Furabath obviously healing my Garius. Garius is doing a good amount of healing himself, so the more kind of less suitable, less perfect options you're using, the more support you will need to bring in to make sure your team and your tanks are staying alive through this encounter. But these do remain the best options, especially in the early kind of stages of Season 2, where you don't have the gear to build incredibly strong, fast, and, well, speed teams effectively. There are teams who can do this boss in less than 20 seconds. I personally would prefer to build a team like this because it's a little bit more relatable to everybody else, so there's no point showcasing a fast team. I've not even put the effort in to build a speed team myself. I probably could build a relatively fast team, but yeah. So if we get onto kind of different options, let's have a look. As you can see in my run, I wasn't using the 5x elemental bonus, so that is a way of getting a good amount of stats into your team. But in terms of different damage options, if we look, we could use a burn team, for example. They are great at AoE, and they'd allow you to really cut through the orbs fast. So you could use a combination of, obviously, if you don't have any of the legendaries, Arasi's the epic is incredibly strong with his ultimate skill. As long as you've got heroes who can enable his burn. So the best burn enabler in the game is Calf without any doubt at all. But I don't have him, so I imagine a lot of people don't. So you could use a mix of any of the other legendaries. The epics are relatively good, but the rares are incredibly strong. So for single target, Percival kind of takes the edge. He does do a little bit more than Beegs, but Beegs is really good at AoE because the ultimate skill here, as you can see, it strikes an AoE radius each time hitting a different enemy, well, potentially a different enemy, with a chance of inflicting burn on them for 10 seconds. So there are ways of enabling burn heroes without having Calf. I've been playing around with it a little bit myself and will be using it into the second month of the season. So yeah, Beegs is a really strong option. As I say, Arasi's is kind of the core damage dealer outside of the legendaries like Ashetius and Durham. So bear that in mind when you're building a team if you choose to go the fire and necrosis way. In terms of frost, obviously, if we look at frost and ice blast, I will say ice blast is a little bit less viable in Grave of Venom because they're going to single target all of the orbs. It does mean it's going to be a little bit slower, but once you do get those orbs down and they can focus on the boss, they will melt that boss quickly. But I prefer to have the more kind of a more AoE approach to deal with the orbs faster, and then have a bit of a slower, more relaxed approach to the actual boss. So you could use a combination of a AoE freeze enabler, so somebody like Losenia, somebody like Rava, the epic, to put frost on everybody, and then a damage dealer like, for example, I use Oster. You could use Drist. You could use Usha. Usha does a lot of damage as well. So there is lots of options in the Frost and Ice Blast elements. Obviously, like I say, I do lean more towards Frost over Ice Blast and Grave of Venom. And Rally is incredibly strong at clearing through the Grave of Venom just because they deal so much AoE damage, they can just nuke everything. So having the legendary options like Lauren, Theo, Filto, Huberg, they will tear through this boss in seconds. But if you don't have those, you can use an enabler like Alvis, for example, and then some of the epic damage dealers like Hegio. Hegio does a really good amount of damage, and there are rares who can do good damage as well, like Welby. Welby's really strong. I used Welby in Season 1 myself, not in Grave of Venom exactly, but I did use him for the Continental bosses and the endgame boss. Same goes for Chaos. Chaos is really good at dealing relatively strong AoE damage in a 3-line path. So as long as you position her well, she'll be able to hit the orbs and the boss. Next up, if we look at lightning, so one of the most common ways to nuke things in this game is Dauntless, just because they deal so much damage in such a short space of time. So having a Dauntless team will be able to tear through this boss as well, but you could also lean towards a Thunderbolt team. I personally think Thunderbolt is a little bit mediocre unless you've got all of the legendaries. So especially Shinaktan and Pakunte, they just work so well together, and it allows Pakunte to get a large amount of stacks of his passive before his ultimate skill goes off. Yeah, he gets 1 stack of Overwhelm whenever the Electrocutors is triggered, and then his ultimate skill takes all of those stacks, each one of them increasing his damage by 3%. So yeah, it's a really good way of dealing with that as long as you've got the enablers for it, and of course the legendary heroes to deal with the damage. Poison, I don't think is particularly great for speedrunning. It potentially could be. I've not got the heroes to test it out myself. You'd need people like Durango, Twitch, and Lothair to deal a huge amount of damage. Maybe something I can play around with later in the season, or if I get access to the test server. So I kind of sway away from Poison personally. But aside from that, obviously there are great options. There are so many healers in the game who could replace my Jillian. You could use Catherine, you could even use Meredith, the common hero, as well as a large amount of options from other elements. So my personal favourite is Adolphus from the fire element. I use him wherever I can. So his shields are absolutely massive and will mitigate the need for a healer in many situations. So bear that in mind when you're building a team. If you want to get the 5x elemental bonus, and especially if you're using burn, then Adolphus could be a really good option for you. But yeah, I will leave it there for that video today. I do plan on covering all of the dungeons in the next few days to really show how to best make teams ahead of the increase in drop rates for legendary gear coming this Friday. Obviously, that will depend on the server you're on. The server I'm on, which started Season 2 on release day, does go live on Friday. So, yeah, other than that, just a thank you for watching the video today, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.